Good afternoon. Well, underwhelming indeed, and a bit of a concern, because if these temporary measures don't turn out to be temporary measures and turn out to be permanent, then the South African fiscus is in deep trouble, and we'll find out just how deep in the 2024 budget speech. There's a lot riding on that, but we've already heard that the reconfiguration of the government is something that is not going to go away. We're not going to turn back on that one, and there have been a lot of things that have been introduced this year that are quite concerning as far as where the fiscus is and where the money is going to come from. At least we did not hear much on the value-added tax, but we are expecting that, because that is the prerogative of the February budget. We were waiting for the leader of the EFF to come through, and I don't know if it is you who is speaking to us. Yes, please, this is, as you know, Floyd Shivambu, the Deputy President of the EFF. What do you make of this particular MTBPS 2023?
No, look, the normal process is that in the October or early November of each and every year, the Minister of Finance tables the medium-term budget policy statement, which is a budget review of the budget which was presented in February or March. And what has happened today was an acknowledgement by the Minister of Finance that the state has not been able to collect enough revenue and will therefore reduce a lot of budget allocations that were initially made. So there's a lot of austerity measures that have been introduced. Some of the things which were not said. So there's more than 6.2 billion reduction on the conditional grants that were given to provinces. And there's more than 3.2 billion that was reduced to the conditional grants for municipalities. And we think that is unacceptable. How do you reduce conditional grants to provinces that are meant for educational infrastructure, for healthcare? How do you reduce grants to municipalities that are meant to respond to floods, for instance? So there's a lot of austerity measures which are being introduced by this Minister of Finance, and that is unacceptable. But also, this nonsense of trying to reduce the wage bill by cutting down the number of government employees is problematic, because South Africa has got a huge crisis of unemployment. And to then, as a solution, to look into a reduction of the state size in an irrational way is just going to worsen the poverty of our people. So this budget, it's about consolidation of poverty. It's not fiscal consolidation. It's poverty consolidation that is going to become worse for our people, because the national government, the national treasury is failing, one, to grow the economy, two, to maximally and optimally collect revenue from the normal sources of revenue collection. And we're in a crisis that is going to deepen because we do not have leadership that is decisive in the economy of South Africa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Floyd Shivambu, the Deputy President of the EFF. He is saying this is a poverty reduction, not really the fiscus, really something that is serious to consider. But Ntokozo, my colleague, is with the DA finance spokesperson, and that is Dr. Dion George. Ntokozo, to you.
Thanks, Xolani. Well, I am with Dr. Dion George, as you rightfully said, and he says for the Democratic Alliance, the statement was a rather disappointing one, and he is with me here right now. Doctor, tell us why you found the budget disappointing this year, or the midterm budget policy statement.
It clearly was a medium-term budget policy statement from an ANC government that doesn't care about vulnerable South Africans. We did set out our expectations beforehand, and one of the very easily doables for the minister was to make life easier for battling South Africans who are unable to put enough food on the table. 81% of South African households are missing a meal a day, and that's unacceptable in a rich country such as ours. So there was no mention at all on relief. For example, cutting the fuel taxes and levies, that was easily doable. Also, increasing the zero VAT rated basket of food could have been done. What we do welcome is the extension of the social relief of distress grant for another year, but there is no comprehensive social security plan and there's no budget for it. So the Minister has quite a bit of explaining to do, and I will take the opportunity to ask him tomorrow when we see him in Parliament. Also, if you look at growth, for example, we do note that government is now talking very much about private public partnerships, which has been long-standing DA policy in infrastructure development. We obviously support that, but there's no other incentives to get our economy growing, to create the jobs that we need. Also, if we look at debt, for example, that carries on going upward. There is no sign that that's going to abate in the medium term. The Minister is talking about fiscal anchors, and that speaks directly to a private member's bill that the DA has already introduced in Parliament for responsible spending. So we'll have to see how that goes, but the problem is debt's spiralling up too much, and what's happening is it's starting to crowd out service delivery. Very much cuts that are going to happen now to departments. The DA does not support those taxes because obviously it wouldn't be necessary if there weren't never-ending bailouts to the state-owned enterprises. The Minister's also now talking about a bailout or a debt transfer of the Transnet's debt. So here we go again. It's much better to rather implement the DA's model where, like the infrastructure development, you inject the private sector into that. So that is very much doable. On the electricity blackouts, there's no additional plan. The lights are still off. The Minister's still talking about a plan, but where is that actual concrete plan? And then, of course, the support for vulnerable South Africans. He never mentioned the cost of living once in his speech. And that means that they're totally out of touch with what's actually happening on the ground. And that's the biggest disappointment, I think, is that what does this mean for the average South African family battling to put enough food on the table? That government has done nothing because it simply doesn't care. And that's obviously a major problem. And then also, if we look at the problem we have on corruption, the Minister's now saying that we are likely to be able to get off the grey list by 2025. So there's no sense of urgency. Now, our view is that there should be. And you can do that by putting more money on the judiciary, and there is no additional spend on that. The DA's view is you can put at least 1.8 billion extra on it. So overall, very disappointing. No new plans. Nothing actually to look forward to other than hardship, because our economy is definitely going the wrong way. But of course, I'll ask him questions tomorrow, and also, of course, in the lead up to February, we will carry on, obviously, putting our alternatives, because the people deserve better than this.
Thank you so much for talking to us. Of course, that is DA's Deon George saying that from the DA's point of view, it is a rather disappointing budget. So we are going to still hear some reactions. Xolani has more people that are still coming out of that statement that we just heard from Finance Minister.
Thank you very much, Ntokozo. We have the ANC Secretary General. He needs no introduction. That is Mr. Fikile Mbalula of the ANC. Mr. Mbalula, your initial reaction as the governing party in South Africa.
Thank you very much. As we said in our media briefing today, the medium-term budget statement has actually affirmed a number of things that we expected the minister to talk about. First, the issue of reforms in terms of the state assets and to capitalize them. Reforms include unbundling, ensuring that Transnet is able to respond to the task of ensuring that it is a state entity that is able to deliver on its mandate. But at the same time, we remain committed to our project of infrastructure rollout plans. But at the same time, most importantly, is the cushioning of the poor and ensuring that social protection is enhanced in terms of the programs that are intact at the present moment. But over and above, to ensure that education and health, there's still more investment in relation to that in the reprioritization plan of the budget going forward. So we're very much ecstatic and very happy within the constraints that the minister has been able to keep the balance.
Are you not worried that the reconfiguration might lead to job losses in government when it comes to the attrition rate? There is going to be a lot of people who are over the age of 50 who are encouraged to actually take severance packages to lower the headcount in government. That could lead to the corporate services and service delivery itself suffering.
Well, it is not. I mean, if you look into it, because at the same time it opened up a space to ensure that we bring fresh capability into the system, but at the same time it will account for better service delivery and moving faster in terms of ensuring that the service delivery replenishment is able to bring in fresh blood into the system and ensuring that government move faster when it comes to ensuring that we meet our promises that we have made to our people.
Mr. Mbalula, thank you very much for your time. That is Mr. Philip Mbalula, the Secretary General of the ANC, reacting to the budget, and I believe Ntokozo has the Deputy President of the IFP, Nkosi Mzamo Buthelezi.
Is it on me? Yes? Are you on me? Okay. Yeah, well, we do have the... Oh.
Thank you very much. We have the UDM leader, that is Ngamba Yomzi Nkwakwa, who is the UDM chief whip. And as we get a reaction here from the City Hall, MP, thank you very much for your time. Your reaction as the UDM, what is your take from this midterm budget 2023?
Well, the minister and his government called us here in order to tell us that the country is broke, and they do not have a plan of action of how to resolve that. For example, how do you explain that for the next 3 years the country will borrow about 553 billion rands in order for it to be able to meet its expenditure needs and to deal with the ESCOM issue? The other aspect is your debt service costs are ballooning to the value of about 400 billion rands, which is beginning to crowd that expense on the social wage. But you'll recall that in about 2006 there was an ASGISA, an economic policy of the ANC. If you remember, they adopted ASGISA, and one of the issues they wanted to address in ASGISA are binding constraints, which were seeking to deal with the national logistics system. 20 years later, that system has completely collapsed. So we are not only affected by the collapse of the national logistics system, we are impacted by load shedding, nothing works. There's no proper governance or management of the country's finances. People are cavalier with the country's resources. The last aspect I've said this thing many times before, that whenever the ANC makes a commitment about fighting corruption, their commitment is as credible as a cat that makes a commitment that it's going to conduct a commission of inquiry into the disappearance of mice, because they are responsible for the mess and the quagmire in which we find ourselves.
What do you make of the fact that this disappointing, lackluster midterm budget policy statement comes, even though as it is in an election year? Does it paint a picture that things are worse than they seem?
It actually paints a picture that, if you were to quote William Butler Yeats, things are falling apart because the center cannot hold. The center has not been holding for a long time, and it's an indication that the people of South Africa need to look for solutions to our country's problems elsewhere. The ANC can no longer be able to provide that to them.
Thank you very much. That is Ngabayomzi Nkwakwa, the Chief Whip of the UDM, and I believe my colleague Ntokozo has the Deputy President of the IFP, that is Nkosi Mzamo Buthelezi.
Well, I am actually here with him just to get that reaction. Thank you for talking to us. A comprehensive budget that touched on various things. Talk us through your reaction to that midterm budget.
As the IFP, there is nothing to celebrate. The future of our country is not looking good. As the Minister actually said, that the debt is too high, remains too high. Our economic outlook is very bleak, and it can't even make 1 mark growth which is a serious problem, because that speaks to also issue of unemployment. The public wage bill remains very high, and the minister said nothing in terms of his intervention in trying to address the issue of unemployment. As the IFP, we are remaining very worried about that, the fact that the minister didn't actually address all the issues that we felt he should address. But we are only having one hope. Our hope remains that next year comes where people of South Africa will elect a government that has a keen interest to address their problems, because the same problems can't be entrusted to the ANC, which is the cause of it.
Mr. Buthelezi, thank you so much for giving us those insights. Of course, that is the IFP's Mthunzi Buthelezi, Mzamo Buthelezi rather, and I understand that my colleague Xolani is standing with another member of parliament from the Good Party, so I'll throw back to Xolani.
Thank you very much, Ntokozo. We do indeed have Brett Harron, who is an MP with the Good Party in the National Assembly. Brett, thank you very much for your time, as always. Your initial reaction to the midterm budget this year?
Well, I think I'm relieved that there were no unpleasant surprises. I mean, we went in expecting there to be a revenue shortfall, which there is. The revenue shortfall at 54.7 billion rand is not out of line with what we've had in previous financial years. In fact, it's substantially less than the last 2 financial years. I'm relieved that the so-called austerity measures that were being bandied about and talked about have not been implemented, because austerity measures means cuts to social spend, education, health, police and social security. The Minister is committed to that there will be no cuts to those essential services that many poor people rely on. And I'm relieved that there's no cuts to the infrastructure program that we have committed to over the last few years. And as long as that infrastructure spend addresses our energy transmission problems, our freight logistics problems and our water problems, then I think we're on the right path. So I left the room feeling less pessimistic and concerned than I went into the room because I think that there were no shocks or surprises, and the revenue shortfall of 54.7 billion rand, although disappointing, is not out of ordinary and is manageable.
Mr. Harron, as we head into the elections, are you more concerned about the health of the fiscus than ever before?
I'm concerned about the health of the fiscus to the extent that we are spending money on unnecessary programs or allocating to programs that are not delivering outcomes that are meaningful for communities. So I would like to see spend shift to social security more. I'm relieved that the SRD, or Social Relief of Distress grant of 350 rand per month has been extended for another year, but 350 rand per month is not nearly enough to meet the food poverty line of 760 rand per person per month. And so the extension is welcome, but the amount is still far too low. And the restructuring of government that the Minister committed to and said that the President will address in SONA next year must include prioritizing social security, because people cannot wake up, 11 million people cannot wake up every single day unable to find a job and are expected to live on zero. And 350 rand per month doesn't cut it. So I'm concerned about the fiscal state of our country, but I'm concerned more about the priorities of spend.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harron, there of the Good Party, saying 350 rands per month is not going to cut it for 11 million South Africans who apparently have to skip a day for a proper meal. I believe that my colleague Ntokozo has the leader of the ACDP in Parliament.
Thanks, Xolani. Well, I am here with Steve Swart with the SADP to get some of your reactions. What are your thoughts on the midterm budget policy statement just presented by Finance Minister?
Well, our main concern has been realized, and that is the increase in fiscal deficit. As opposed to what was forecast in February, we see it's increased quite dramatically, and that means that obviously revenue that has been collected is not covering government expenditure, and that means an increase in government debt levels and debt service costs. And the Minister indicated that is the fastest growing item on the budget. And that crowds out expenditure much needed on health, on education, on criminal justice sector. So we've got to stimulate that. We've got to stimulate economic growth to deal with the budget deficit. And we have to then, to do that, we've got to deal with the power outages and Transnet logistic problems at both the rail and harbours. And we saw that 50 billion rand was lost to the mining industry through the rails. So we've got to stimulate economic growth, create jobs so that we can collect more revenue to balance the books. We also believe, and I see the Commissioner is right here next to us, that more can be done to collect taxes that are due and owing but haven't been collected. There's 300 billion rand sitting in the government debt book for SARS. If 10% of that is collected, that's 30 billion rand. That can go to help balance the books. So in February we'll see all the details. We really, as the ACDP, do not support an increase in taxes. We believe government needs to look at expenditure. They need to collect the billions of rands that have been stolen through state capture and corruption. That can also be collected and can be used to help balance the books. But it is quite a dire outlook, and we need to make sure that we are good stewards of what is entrusted to us. It's not the ANC government's money, it is the people's money, and we need to make sure it is spent wisely when it comes to the budget deficit, and that it is reduced in the medium term.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. I am with the SARS Commissioner, Edward Kisvetter. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for your time this afternoon. Not a good time to be listening to such a somber news about revenue collection. You are the man at the top. What's happening with revenue collection? The projection seems to have changed from MTBPS 2022 to this year.
It's never a good time for a tax man. We're always under pressure because somehow government tend to spend more money than what we can collect. But, you know, the minister's message today is a somber message, not a negative message. It is somber to the extent that net revenues have slowed down and expenditure has a lot of pressure on it, and if you don't find more revenue or change your expenditure, you have to borrow more, and if you have to borrow more, that's not a free choice. But the underlying positive message for us in the revenue numbers is actually when you look at the gross revenue line. And gross revenue has actually increased by 4.5% year on year in an economy that is projected to grow at 4.3%. And if you look at where that growth comes from, you see good growth in the financial services sector. You see good growth in the wholesale and retail sector. You see good growth in the community services sector. Where we are not seeing good growth is in mining and quarrying. And that's also understandable because that sector has a huge dependency on electricity as well as logistics, rail transport to the ports. So understandably, in the mining and quarrying sector, you've seen a contraction, but even that will begin to turn around as self-generation comes on board and as the impact of the deregulation of the electricity sector and of the transport and logistics sector takes effect. We've seen the benefit already in electricity supply. So we believe that the gross revenue gives you a better sense that there's actually a lot of vibrancy in the economy, but held back by electricity and logistics. The other lens through which you have to look at what's happening in the economy is the refunds that we've paid out. We've paid out 29 billion rand more refunds year to date than what we have paid out last year. And 25 billion more than what we expected in terms of the printed estimate. And if you have to then look through what is driving that refunds, because that gives you a sense of the economic activities. So let me mention a few. Firstly, the inflationary impact by businesses on their input costs. So if you're paying more for your fuel, more for your electricity, more for your labor, it means that downstream we will give you more refunds. Secondly, we have seen through self-generation a significant increase in the value and volume of solar panels, of inverters and batteries. Those input costs, because it's capital, can be claimed by businesses and then they get a refund for that. And then we are still working hard on managing the integrity of the refund system to prevent impermissible refunds. So the higher than predicted outflow due to revenue of 29 billion, actually if we didn't have that, we would not have a shortfall in net revenue. And that's why I say it's important to balance gross refund with net revenue to understand what's happening. Then the picture is not that bleak. It's actually a picture that says we have to be more disciplined in the short term, and if we maintain the focus of an efficient revenue administration, we've seen, for example, a 28% year-on-year increase in compliance revenue collection. So we are hopeful that if we maintain that focus, the Minister's discipline message is maintained, that we should, over the medium term, begin to see a reversal of those trends.
Last week, your office was forced to apologize to South Africans for what some were considering to be quite forceful messages on the side of SARS sending to taxpayers with businesses that are lying dormant, whose tax returns have not been filed, with serious messages coming from SARS saying you will be in trouble. It spoke of a SARS that is desperate to find funds anywhere and everywhere, one way or the other. I can tell you that a lot of South Africans were in fear until SARS came out to apologize. But if you can clarify that part of what caused SARS this time around to speak in the manner that it did to South African taxpayers and say that you might face this, you might face that. South Africans want to hear from the Commissioner why it had to get to that point.
Firstly, I hope South Africans are encouraged that SARS owns up when it messes up. We didn't make excuses. We said the way the message went out fell significantly short of our level of professionalism. So let me just, for the interest of those who listen, explain a few things. The content of the message was absolutely correct, which in short means if you do not submit your returns, you are breaking the law. We are required to remind you, and if you ignore that reminder, you are liable for prosecution and could face criminal consequence. So there's nothing wrong with that message. What was wrong was it was sent to all taxpayers, honest and dishonest taxpayers. And I can also give South Africans the assurance we've taken action, we've managed consequences, we've addressed the failure that allowed that message to go through. SARS consists of 12,500 people, of over 2,000 managers, and sometimes one or the other is out of sync, and you have something like that happen. What should have happened was that we frame that message as a media statement and send it out as a nudge for taxpayers. Instead, the message went out as an SMS. And of course, if I'm an honest taxpayer that is up to date, I do my things diligently, for me then to receive what sounds to be a threatening message, technically correct message, but to me as an honest taxpayer, totally inappropriate. And I think that's the medium and the way we sent out that message fell short of what we ought to have done. And we took action, and I can't say it will never happen again because we have men and women who make decisions, but we're strengthening our governance process and we learn from those mistakes because we are truly committed. There's no desperation. We are truly committed to help taxpayers understand their obligations, to make it easy for them to fulfill those obligations, and then in the service of honest taxpayers to catch the crooks and to make them face the consequence of their ways.
Commissioner, thank you very much for your time. Well, you heard the Commissioner there saying that he apologizes for the message that actually went out. It was a correct message, but it went to honest and dishonest taxpayers, and something that rattled a lot of taxpayers in South Africa. Ntokozo, I believe, is with the Secretary General of Fedusa, Ashifa Ajam.
Thank you, Xolani. Well, you are here with Finance Minister. I suppose we could try catch you while he passes by. Just talk us through the reactions to this year's MTBP.
Well, broadly from Fedusa, we welcome the tabling of the MTBPS by the Minister, naturally with caution. Many of the elements that have been tabled today are not necessarily new items. They have been addressed previously, and what we want to see now is action and implementation.
And just where do you think are some of those improvement areas, especially with that implementing and doing that action? Which areas do you think that the Finance Ministry or Treasury could work on?
Okay, well, first and foremostly, let's focus on the positive elements now in terms of the structural reforms. We have heard loud and proud Transnet in particular, part of those SOEs that we have been dealing with and we have been crying out for. So the collaborative approach in this instance and the inclusive one is most certainly welcomed, in particular to managing the debt. So ultimately, with the notion of the roadmap, we look forward to dealing with it decisively, because Transnet is one of those SOEs like Eskom that is too big to fail. It has got a direct and vested interest, not only in terms of labour but business, and trying to move South Africa into that competitive and capable motion is what we are looking for, and we most certainly welcome the approach that has been tabled today.
Rifta, thank you so much for giving us those insights from Fedusa. Of course, that's Fedusa's General Secretary, and that's Rifta Ajam. And I do understand, as we saw, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana heading over to my colleague Xolani, and they're standing by now.
Ntokozo, thank you very much. I am indeed standing with the Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwana. Minister, thank you for your time. I heard your speech, and many South Africans did, including international investors. Something that you said in that speech was, these are temporary measures for long-term solutions. What if these measures become permanent when it comes to all of the reconfiguration, trying to find the money, and those measures lead to losses of jobs, the attrition rate is too high, and they don't become temporary, but rather permanent?
They're not going to be permanent. I raised 4 things which are critical. I raised electricity, I raised logistics, I raised crime. All of these things, the President addressed them. And he said more work is a positive development in dealing with this. I raised the 3rd element, which is within my purview, all right, which is infrastructure, government investment. Watch the space next year.
Watch this space next year. An extension of 12 months for the Social Relief of Distress Grant, which is coming as good news. Where are we when it comes to basic income grant? Are we going to have to watch the space next year on that one?
To my knowledge, government has not taken a view on basic income grant. All I do know is that this grant was a temporal done during COVID. It was not intended to be a long-term grant. So that's where my head is at the moment. However, we make the point that we need to start a review of the entire social protection program and see how will this grant look like in the moment. How will active labor market policy fit in? How does social insurance fit into these things? So that's the program we're engaged in as government at the moment.
And this midterm budget, we were not expecting you to make any announcement when it comes to tax changes, but that is the prerogative of the cabinet and the president, and also changes that are made in February. Can we say that we should expect and watch that space in terms of value-added tax and the like?
No.
On taxes, I'm muted. Because taxes are normally done in February and are normally done in a more sensitive way because they may have, they are market sensitive. So they are done in February. I can't say whether we'll have taxes or no taxes at all. All I can tell you, I do have a minimum figure of 15 billion. Where will that come from? I don't know. But I know that my tax people said there's a minimum figure we can project of 15 billion.
And if you don't find it via VAT, can you find it through other taxes, personal income tax?
I don't know. They said 15 billion, that's all, is a minimum they can guarantee me for the moment.
Minister, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Minister Enoch Godongwana speaking to us there, saying that he can't say much about any tax changes, and of course those do not come in the midterm budget policy statement, but there could be something in the February budget, as is the normal practice that changes to taxes actually happen in February. I believe that Ntokozo has the Black Business Council. Over to you, Ntokozo.
Thanks, Xolani. Well, I am indeed with the Black Business Council President, and that's Elias Monache. Thank you so much for talking to us. Now, already, as we were chatting on the sidelines, you were highlighting a few missives from the statement that we heard this afternoon. Talk us through that.
Quite right. Thanks to you and to the listeners or viewers at home. I think it is a sad day for us, for particularly the Minister of Finance in his midterm budget statement to miss critical areas, particularly on the procurement bill, because you have just brushed it aside. The essence of that bill, in the main, supposed then to entrench Treasury as the custodian of procurement on behalf of government. That's one. Two, again, it's a sad day for us because he didn't even mention any timelines in terms of when will the bill be finalized, despite the fact that a number of organizations have made submissions in the Standing Committee on Finance, particularly on the question of set aside for various categories of entities and individuals. The 40% aside for black women, people living with disabilities, the youth, and moreover to redress the economic imbalances using state procurement to that effect. And I'm saying for us, our intention, we thought it would be ideal for him then to have timelines to say when will the bill be signed into an act, so that there is a clear centralization of procurement. But again, for us it's a sad day because he continued talking about state organs developing their own policies, and we're then saying it cannot be business as usual because the act in the main must then provide centralization of government procurement in its entirety, so that there is no ambiguity, there is no grey areas in terms of where and how do they procure. And I'm saying for us, those are the shortcomings of this budget statement. Secondly is around a lack of a dedicated category of small, medium enterprises to say what are the things that government they intend doing in terms of either paying a special attention, including even either a special economic package for them, as they were heavily affected on both the COVID and the load shedding of ESCOM. So our intention was that it will be ideal for him then to have a dedicated economic package in terms of the recovery, but again, he's silent on the issues. The last part for us is around a clear question in terms of the consolidation of government departments or SOEs. There's no clarity in terms of how and when will that take place, because in the main, again, it's around state procurement in addressing the balance of the past. So for us, those are the critical areas for us in this budget that are limited.
Thank you so much for giving us those insights. Of course, that is from the Black Business Council, the president there, Elias Monache, just saying about some of the misses that they feel this year's MTBPS statements from the Finance Minister had. And I understand Xolani is now standing by with Dr. Ntabiseng Moloko.
Thank you very much, Ntokozo. Yes, indeed, we still are getting more reaction, and I am with the Economist, and who is with the Stellenbosch Business School, and this is Dr. Ntabiseng Molego. Dr. Molego, we spoke earlier, just before the start of the MTBPS. Your expectations versus what happened this afternoon, what are your big outtakes?
I think, thank you so much. Number one, growth expectations have been revised downwards. So the Minister of Finance has announced that growth, previously Treasury had overestimated from 0.9 down now to 0.8. The outer year, 1.5, which was previously, by the way, 1.8, and it's now been revised downwards to 1.4. What that means effectively, it has two effects. One, the revenue that you collect is based on the size of your GDP. So that 28% of GDP that informs the 1.9 trillion that we are expecting to use as expenditure is now going to be revised and shifted downwards. There is a shortfall. The second aspect is that he has also reported that on the expenditure side, we have dropped it by only 21 billion. What that means is the offset of the revenue that we're collecting is lower than the actual decline in the expenditure. So the offset will come in from increasing our debt. So it's the very thing we spoke about. So what that means is that the 4.8 trillion is going to go up, 4.8 is going to go up now to 5.2 in terms of debt. And the difference of that amount is 400 billion, which will be allocated for the budget deficit. That is also widening to 4.9% from 4. So there's almost 1 percentage point difference. What that means for South Africans, and I think just to unpack that, it simply means that we are not growing. There is an economic stagnation that the National Treasury seemingly hasn't put enough reforms in place that are yielding results. The second thing is to note from his speech is that he spoke about structural reforms, but the same type of structural reforms that they always mention in the budget speech. Logistics, railway, reforms around Eskom. It's interesting now that they're taking on not just the Eskom, but also municipal Eskom debt relief of 29 municipalities, or 28 out of 67 that have applied, amounting to another 56 billion write-off for municipalities. Now you must remember, none of this expenditure is going to growth or income enhancement. It's simply money to borrowing from Paul to Peter to pay for Paul. And this is the problem. And I think this is the fiscal outlook conundrum we're facing. There is no growth outlook. There are no reforms that are going to propel us towards higher growth. Our emerging market counterparts, Xolani, are having up to 4, 5, 6% growth on average. We are experiencing less than half, even a fraction of that growth at 0.8 revised downwards. IMF and other economists even range it from 0.3 to 0.5 at almost half what Treasury is projecting. So Treasury has very optimistic outlooks, and it does come through with the revisions that we always see in the medium policy budget statement halfway in the year, where you see minor assumptions not being met, collections not being met on the basis of forecasts just on the corporate income tax, primarily because of commodity slowdown in prices, and you're not collecting the same as you did from mining houses, and so that revenue collection has gone down. So our assumptions in the fiscal framework are somewhat problematic in that they're not always plausible and they don't always reach the projections.
Do you think that could mean a high likelihood that government could come knocking at our doors as taxpayers to actually say, on the value-added tax side, we might increase come February next year by 1%. We know it's regressive, or on personal income taxes, because he just said, as the finance minister, he needs to find by February next year 15 billion rands somewhere, and we need to watch that space come February. How likely is that?
So we've seen from the collections, and I know that the commissioner, the SARS commissioner, year to date, VAT collections and personal income collections are on par with expectations. I know 2 years ago we saw the increase in VAT. We also have seen some downward revisions by a percentage point on your corporate income tax. The issue in South Africa, if they increase taxation on VAT, and households. Number one, households are constrained. The high interest environment that they are operating in now means that not only is there increase, because our household to debt income ratios for households is fairly high, over 70%. Our households are incredibly indebted. So every time our governor increases the repo rate and we're seeing our prime interest rate go up, our people are constrained in terms of having less disposable income to put back into our economy to make purchases. That's number one. So the second aspect is that the general economic environment, less people are working, 12 million South Africans are unemployed, and we're also seeing a large proportion of our people suffering on the increase of fuel hikes. Yes, there have been some downward revisions recently, but the projections and the general oil price has been fairly high. And I think we are struggling as general households to survive with less disposable income because of the high interest rate environment, but also the cost of living, which has increased substantially. So households have less money to inject into the economy. If you take money away from households through more taxation, it has a trade-off effect. So even if you try to compress and increase collections, it may have a downward revision of GDP overall because of the multiplier effect. That's number one. I think the second, on the corporate income tax side, South Africa's economy is reliant heavily on your mining houses and your financial sector. Your big four, in terms of your ABSA, your retail banks, let me rather not mention names. Those are the ones that the Revenue Authority has collected as expected. The failure is because of our exports. We know that our rail and our logistics infrastructure is not at optimal and operating at optimal levels. So the export earnings have slumped. What that effectively means is that the revenue collected have slumped because profits have slumped and are not as high as could be. So the optimal level haven't been reached. The question, I think, that needs to be asked, and that's the fundamental question that every South African should be asking, is what is the plan to revive our economy? What is the plan to revive economic growth? What is the plan to ensure that everyone in our households is working if they are at an age where they can work? Making sure the semi-skilled and even our highly skilled and even our low-skilled youth are in our factories, are in the rural areas working. If they're not working, they are being capacitated with skills in our educational facilities. That is what we need to know. And fundamental to that is the capability and the capacity of the state. If the state, not just through the SOEs, if the state through all the departments where we are disbursing more than 2.2 trillion this year, are not using that money in a manner that is efficient and produces and generates and enhances output, we have a problem. So you have to ensure that our state not only uses the 2.2 trillion that is disbursed to all the different budget votes within our MTF, but ensuring that the capabilities are enhanced so that we see impact. And I think those are the fundamental critical questions. They're not being answered. We are staying with now our budget growth. 5 years ago, we were estimating 3-4% growth. 2 years ago, we were estimating 1.8% growth. Now we are sitting at 0 point. We're sitting, if I round it down, because I'm a statistician, it's 0. We're sitting at a 0% growth. And the issue here is what needs to be done to get us out of this, because there are things, and if our current Politburo doesn't have the ideas, I think we need to put the ideas together and ensure that they are executed.
All of this talks to a fiscal cliff that we are facing right now. But earlier on, you wanted to make an observation about pensions. Tell us more about that.
So one of the critical constraints when you talk about a budget is the funding gap, isn't it? We know that there's a funding gap in terms of funding not just the fiscus, but also the infrastructure. So what I've done a lot of research about and I've looked at is to say, what is the role of capital markets? What is the role of pension funds, institutional investors, in terms of the development trajectory? Do they have a role to play that can be enhanced beyond simply providing credit extension, through private sector credit extension to households in the form of credit cards, loan finance for cars and homes, and so forth. What role do financial institutions play in the development question? Do they play a role? Absolutely. So the answer that I've proposed, and fortunately we've seen some movement in terms of regulatory framework. One, there is an asset allocation class called infrastructure assets. We need to start looking at alternative ways to raise capital outside of debt, but use our savings and capital markets in a structured way, in a way where we use instruments and mechanisms that have been proven to work in Australia, in Canada, United States, in the whole of Europe, where they don't have the infrastructure gap and the capital-intensive needs that South Africa has currently. And I'm saying that we have got to propel and ensure the support and the mechanisms to support infrastructure finance, and making sure that the private sector and the private sector participation is crowded in to enhance that aspect of collaboration between the private sector, the state, and some of the agencies in place right now. We heard about a new agency. We don't know the details exactly, but the infrastructure fund has been established to bolster that, to fast-track that. But the progress that will fast-track and increase what we call gross capital formation, we are not anywhere near the rate of rapid movement that we need. And I think that we've got to put our, if I can say, gears. We need to get into sixth gear. We are in first.
In reverse, it seems, because our economic growth at 0.8% forecast is not really looking good. Dr. Nthabiseng Moleko, thank you very much for your time. She is an economist at the Stellenbosch Business School, and a lot to mull over in terms of what needs to happen and what is happening in South Africa's fiscus, or as far as the National Treasury is concerned. I believe that Ntokozo has dawned on Mukhasha